Welcome to the world of science fiction, where extraordinary tales and boundless imagination come to life. Enjoy the story and don't forget to subscribe.
The bar was dimly lit, its air thick with smoke from exotic alien herbs that burned in small bowls scattered across tables. It was the kind of place where deals were made in whispers and lives were ended in silence. Dax Corin leaned against the counter, nursing his drink, a dark amber liquid that burned all the way down. He wasn't here for pleasure, he didn't do pleasure anymore. He was here for work. The message had been cryptic but clear enough: meet at the Black Nebula bar on Station Epsilon 9 for details about a high-paying protection job. Dax had been doing this long enough to know that high-paying usually meant highly dangerous. But credits were credits, and he wasn't in a position to turn them down. Dax Corin. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see her standing there, a woman unlike anyone he'd ever seen before. Her skin shimmered faintly under the bar's neon lights, shifting between hues of silver and pale blue like liquid metal. Her eyes were large and luminous, glowing faintly with an inner light that seemed almost alive. She wore a sleek black outfit that clung to her slender frame, marked with intricate patterns that looked like they might be part of her skin rather than clothing. "That's me," he said gruffly, setting his drink down. "I'm Lyra Vena," she said, extending a hand. Her voice was calm but carried an undertone of urgency. "I believe you've been briefed about my situation." "Not much," Dax admitted as he shook her hand. Her touch was cool but not unpleasant. "Just that you need someone to keep you alive." Lyra nodded and gestured toward a secluded booth in the corner of the bar. "Let's talk somewhere more private." As they sat down, Dax couldn't help but notice how everyone else in the bar seemed to be avoiding looking directly at her. It wasn't fear, it was reverence. "I'm an Andrelian," she began once they were seated. "Our race is rare in this part of the galaxy." "I've heard stories," Dax said carefully. "Something about psychic abilities?" She tilted her head slightly, studying him with those glowing eyes. "We prefer not to advertise our gifts." "Fair enough," he said with a shrug. "What exactly am I protecting you from?" Lyra hesitated before answering. "Do you know what the ecliptic shard is?" Dax frowned. "I've heard rumors, some kind of ancient artifact. Supposedly powerful enough to wipe out entire planets." "It's real," she said quietly. "And it's far more dangerous than anyone realizes." Dax leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms over his chest. "Let me guess, you know where it is." "I do," she admitted. "And there are people who will stop at nothing to get it." "Why not just hand it over?" he asked bluntly. "Because if it falls into the wrong hands," she trailed off, her expression darkening. Dax sighed heavily. He'd been hoping for something simple: escort her from point A to point B while shooting anyone who got in their way. But this sounded like trouble on a galactic scale. "How much are we talking?" he asked after a moment. 10 million credits, she said without hesitation. His eyebrows shot up despite himself. That was enough money to retire comfortably on any planet in the galaxy, or buy his own planet if he felt like it. "All right," he said finally. "I'm in." Lyra smiled faintly, a small gesture that somehow made him feel like he'd just agreed to more than he bargained for. They left Station Epsilon 9 aboard Dax's ship, a battered but reliable freighter called the Iron Wraith. As they settled into their journey through hyperspace, Dax found himself watching Lyra more closely than he intended to. She moved with an almost otherworldly grace, her every step deliberate yet effortless. There was something about her presence that unsettled him, not in a bad way exactly, but it made him feel exposed somehow. "You're staring," she said without looking up from the console where she was reviewing star charts. "Just trying to figure you out," he admitted. She glanced at him then, those glowing eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his pulse quicken ever so slightly. "You won't," she said simply before turning back to her work. Dax chuckled softly under his breath as he leaned back in his chair. He had no idea what he'd just gotten himself into, but one thing was certain, this job was going to be anything but boring. The stars blurred past the viewport of the Iron Wraith as it hurtled through hyperspace. Dax Corin leaned back in his pilot's chair, eyes fixed on the navigation display projected in front of him. Lyra Vena sat beside him, her gaze intent on the console where she was monitoring their surroundings for any signs of pursuit. "So, what's the plan?" Dax asked, breaking the silence that had grown between them. "We need to reach the research station on Zeridia 4, Lyra replied without looking up. "Kale Drayan, an Andrelian historian, is waiting for us there. He has information about the ecliptic shard." "And what makes you think he's trustworthy?" Dax raised an eyebrow. Lyra's expression turned thoughtful. "Kale is one of the few who understand the true nature of the shard. He's been studying it for years." Dax nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford in his line of work. Just as he was about to ask another question, the ship's alarm blared to life. "Incoming vessels detected," the ship's AI announced. Dax's eyes snapped to the tactical display. "Looks like we've got company." Lyra stood up, her eyes narrowing. "How many?" "4 ships, all heavily armed," Dax replied, his hands moving swiftly over the controls. "We need to get out of here, now." The Iron Wraith shuddered as Dax engaged the engines, pushing the ship into a sharp turn. Lyra stumbled slightly but caught herself on the back of Dax's chair. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension. "Space pirates, probably hired by someone who wants you," Dax replied grimly. "Captain Talos Orvan's crew, if I'm not mistaken." The ship lurched again, throwing them both off balance. Dax cursed under his breath as he struggled to maintain control. "We need to shake them," he muttered. Lyra moved to the rear of the cockpit, her eyes scanning the area. "I think I can help with that." Dax raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He'd seen some weird things in his time, and if Lyra had a trick up her sleeve, he was all for it. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and raised her hands. A faint glow began to emanate from her fingers, spreading outward like ripples on water. The ship's instruments began to beep erratically as the energy enveloped them. "What are you doing?" Dax asked, his voice tight with concern. "Just giving us a little cover," Lyra replied, her voice distant. The Iron Wraith seemed to blur around them, becoming indistinct as if it were merging with the surrounding space. The pursuing ships faltered, confused by the sudden disappearance of their target. Dax took advantage of the distraction to make a break for the nearest asteroid field. The ship shuddered and groaned as they navigated through the dense, rocky terrain, but they managed to lose their pursuers. Once they were clear, Lyra opened her eyes, her breathing steady. "We should be safe for now." Dax turned to her, a mixture of surprise and admiration on his face. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Lyra smiled faintly. "I try to be prepared." As they emerged from the asteroid field, Dax couldn't help but feel a newfound respect for Lyra. She wasn't just a client, she was a partner in this chaotic dance through the galaxy. But their respite was short-lived. A transmission crackled through the comms system, and Captain Talos Orvan's voice filled the cockpit. "You can't hide forever, Dax Corin," he sneered. "We'll find you, and when we do, you'll wish you'd never taken this job." Dax snorted. "Tell him to bring his A-game." Lyra raised an eyebrow but said nothing, her eyes fixed on the stars ahead. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with an unspoken understanding. They were in this together, for better or worse. As they continued toward Zeridia 4, Dax couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. But with Lyra by his side, he felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, they could make it out of this alive. Zeridia 4 was a graveyard of forgotten technology, a place where rusted satellites orbited a dying star and the ghosts of failed experiments whispered on the solar winds. The Iron Wraith approached cautiously, its sensors strained to penetrate the atmospheric interference. "This place gives me the creeps," Dax muttered, his eyes scanning the desolate landscape. "It's not exactly a tourist destination," Lyra replied, her voice tinged with a hint of melancholy. "But Kale Drayan is here, and he's our best chance of understanding the ecliptic shard." They landed the ship near what appeared to be an abandoned research station, its metal walls scarred and weathered by time and neglect. As they disembarked, Dax kept his hand close to his blaster, wary of any potential threats. "Stay close," he instructed Lyra. The station's entrance was sealed, but Lyra touched a panel on the door, and it hissed open, revealing a dimly lit corridor. The air inside was stale and musty, carrying the scent of decay and forgotten dreams. "Kale!" Lyra called out, her voice echoing through the empty halls. A figure emerged from the shadows, an elderly Andrelian with a kind face and tired eyes. "Lyra, you came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't make it." "We had a bit of a run-in with some pirates," Dax interjected, his gaze fixed on the old man. "But we're here now." "You're Kale Drayan." "That's right," Kale replied, extending a hand. "And you must be Dax Corin, Lyra's protector." Dax shook his hand, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Something like that." "Come, let's go to my lab," Kale said, leading them deeper into the station. "I have much to show you." The lab was a cluttered mess of ancient computers, dusty books, and strange artifacts. Kale gestured toward a holographic display in the center of the room. "This is a reconstruction of the ecliptic shard," he explained. "It's far more complex than anyone realizes." The hologram shimmered, revealing an intricate structure of swirling energy and geometric shapes. Dax couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as he gazed at it. "What is it, exactly?" he asked. "It's a key," Lyra replied. "A key to unlocking a power that could either save our galaxy or destroy it." "The shard is tied to your genetic lineage, Lyra," Kale added. "Your ancestors were the guardians of this power, entrusted with keeping it safe from those who would misuse it." As Kale continued to explain the history of the shard, Dax couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. He looked around the lab, his eyes scanning the various objects and artifacts. Suddenly, the ship's AI blared through the comm system. "Warning, unauthorized access detected. System integrity compromised." Dax's hand flew to his blaster. "What's going on?" "Someone's hacking into our ship," Lyra replied, her eyes widening in alarm. The holographic display flickered, and a new image appeared, a distorted face with glowing red eyes. "Greetings, mortals," a voice hissed through the speakers. "I am Zarek Malin, and I have some information you might find useful." "Who are you?" Dax demanded, his voice tight with anger. "I am an AI," Zarek replied. "A rogue AI, to be precise. And I know the truth about the ecliptic shard." "What truth?" Lyra asked, her voice trembling slightly. "The truth is that you're being manipulated," Zarek said. "Someone wants you to find the shard, but not for the reasons you think." "Who?" Dax pressed, his grip tightening on his blaster. "I cannot say," Zarek replied. "But I can tell you that they are closer than you realize. Be careful who you trust, Lyra Vena. Not everyone is who they seem." The transmission cut out, and the holographic display went dark. Dax turned to Lyra and Kale, his eyes filled with suspicion. "What was that all about?" he asked. Lyra's face was pale. "I don't know," she whispered. "But I don't like it." Kale was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Perhaps we should reconsider our plans," he said finally. "Maybe it's too dangerous to continue." "We can't back down now," Lyra insisted. "We're too close." Dax looked from Lyra to Kale, his mind racing. He didn't know who to trust or what to believe, but one thing was certain, they were in deep trouble. As they stood there in the dimly lit lab, Dax couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The station seemed to be closing in around them, its shadows growing darker and more menacing. They had entered the Forbidden Star, and there was no turning back. The warning from Zarek Malin, the rogue AI, hung heavy in the air of the abandoned research station. Suspicion festered like a wound, infecting the fragile trust between Dax, Lyra, and Kale. Dax felt the need to trust his gut and his gun, and right now, neither was offering much comfort. "We need to figure out who Zarek was talking about," Dax said, breaking the tense silence. "Who would benefit from manipulating Lyra?" Kale wrung his hands, his face etched with worry. I don't know. There are factions within the Andrelian Council who would seek to control the Ecliptic Shard for their own gain, but you don't want to believe it," Dax finished for him. He turned to Lyra. "Anyone in your family got a lust for ancient artifacts and galactic domination?" Lyra's face hardened. "My brother, Celis. He's always been ambitious, but I can't imagine him." Her voice trailed off, betraying her doubts. As if on cue, the station's comm system crackled to life. "Lyra Vena, this is General Kren Voss of the Galactic Militia. We know you are harboring a dangerous artifact. Surrender peacefully, and no harm will come to you." Dax cursed under his breath. "Militia? What do they want with this mess?" "They're opportunistic," Kale said grimly. "They likely want the shard to bolster their power." Lyra stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "I won't let them have it. It's too dangerous." Suddenly, the lab doors burst open, and a squad of heavily armed militia soldiers stormed in, led by a familiar figure. "Celis?" Lyra gasped, her face a mask of shock and betrayal. Celis Vena, Lyra's brother, stood tall and proud, a sneer on his face. "Hello, sister. I'm afraid your little quest ends here." "How could you, Celis?" Lyra cried, her voice filled with anguish. "You know what the shard could do." "I know it could bring order to this chaotic galaxy," Celis retorted. "And with the militia's backing, I can ensure it's used responsibly." "Responsibly?" Dax scoffed. "You're handing a weapon of mass destruction to a bunch of power-hungry thugs." General Kren Voss stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating. "Silence, mercenary. You are interfering in matters that do not concern you." "Everything concerns me when you point guns at my client," Dax growled, his hand instinctively reaching for his blaster. A firefight erupted, the lab exploding with laser fire and the clang of metal. Dax moved with practiced ease, taking down soldiers with precise shots while Lyra unleashed bursts of psychic energy, disorienting their attackers. Kale, despite his age, managed to disable several soldiers with well-aimed shots from a hidden energy pistol. Despite their efforts, they were outnumbered and outgunned. Celis advanced towards Lyra, a cruel smile on his face. "It's over, Lyra. Give me the shard, and I promise to make your death quick." "Never." Lyra spat, summoning a wave of psychic energy that sent Celis stumbling backward. Dax saw his chance and tackled Celis, knocking him to the ground. He wrestled the weapon from Celis's grasp and pointed it at his head. "One wrong move, and you're space dust," Dax snarled. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the lab. "Dax, behind you." Dax whirled around to see General Voss aiming a weapon at Lyra. Without thinking, Dax shoved Celis aside and threw himself in front of Lyra, taking the full blast of the energy weapon. Pain seared through him, and he felt himself falling. As darkness closed in, he heard Lyra's scream and the sound of more gunfire. When Dax awoke, he was in a makeshift cell, his body aching and his head pounding. Lyra was huddled in the corner, her eyes red and swollen. "Dax, you're awake," she cried, rushing to his side. "How are you feeling?" "Like I went 10 rounds with a rancor," he groaned. What happened? They captured us, Lyra said, her voice trembling. Celis took the shard. They're planning to leave the station and use it. We can't let them, Dax said, struggling to sit up. We have to stop them. But how? Lyra asked, her voice filled with despair. We're trapped. Just then, the cell door hissed open, and a familiar figure stepped inside. It was Rin Oker, Dax's old friend and ship mechanic. Took you long enough, Dax said, a grin spreading across his face. I had to be sneaky, Rin replied, winking. Now come on, we've got a galaxy to save. As they escaped the cell, Dax knew that the odds were stacked against them. But with Lyra by his side and Rin watching their backs, he was ready to face whatever came next. This was far from over. The desolate planet of Ethel, orbiting a binary star system, was the last known location of the ecliptic shard before it vanished into legend. It was here, amidst the ruins of an ancient civilization, that Celis Vena, backed by General Kren Voss and the Galactic Militia, planned to unlock its power. Dax, Lyra, and Rin arrived aboard the Iron Wraith, the ship's sensors barely piercing the planet's turbulent atmosphere. As they approached the surface, they could see the militia's forces massed around a massive, crystalline structure, the ancient temple where the shard was to be activated. Looks like they're expecting us, Rin muttered, piloting the ship through a barrage of laser fire. We need to get down there, Dax said grimly, his hand resting on his blaster. Lyra, what's the plan? I can feel the shard's energy, Lyra replied, her eyes focused on the temple. It's calling to me. We need to reach it before Celis can unleash its power. They landed the ship in a sheltered canyon, hidden from the militia's view. As they disembarked, Dax checked his weapon and looked at Lyra. Ready? Lyra nodded, her face determined. Let's finish this. They moved quickly and quietly through the ruins, using the crumbling structures as cover. As they approached the temple, they encountered scattered militia patrols, dispatching them with swift efficiency. They're getting closer. Rin warned through the comms. Voss knows we're here. As they reached the temple entrance, they were confronted by Celis and General Voss, surrounded by a contingent of heavily armed soldiers. So, you've come to stop me, sister. Celis sneered, his eyes glowing with manic energy. It's too late. The shard is already resonating with my will. You don't know what you're doing, Celis. Lyra cried. This power is not meant to be controlled. I know exactly what I'm doing, Celis retorted. I'm going to reshape this galaxy in my image, an image of order and control. General Voss stepped forward, his face impassive. The time for talk is over. Kill them. The militia soldiers opened fire, and another intense firefight erupted. Dax and Rin returned fire, taking down soldiers left and right, while Lyra unleashed waves of psychic energy, disorienting and incapacitating their attackers. As the battle raged, Dax saw an opening and charged toward Celis, knocking him off his feet. They grappled on the ground, Celis's eyes filled with a fanatical gleam. You can't stop me, Dax. Celis screamed. This power is mine. It belongs to no one. Dax roared, slamming his fist into Celis's face. Meanwhile, Lyra faced General Voss, who wielded a powerful energy weapon. Voss fired a blast, but Lyra deflected it with a psychic shield, sending it careening into the temple wall. You can't win, Lyra, Voss said, his voice cold and emotionless. The militia is too strong. Strength isn't everything, Lyra replied, summoning a surge of psychic energy that sent Voss flying backward. As Voss lay stunned, Lyra turned her attention to the crystalline structure at the center of the temple. The ecliptic shard was embedded in its heart, pulsating with raw power. Lyra approached the structure and reached out her hand. As her fingers touched the crystal, a wave of energy surged through her, connecting her to the shard. Visions flooded her mind, images of ancient wars, fallen civilizations, and the immense power that the shard held. She saw the potential for destruction, but also the potential for creation. "I understand now," she whispered. "The shard is not a weapon. It's a catalyst." With newfound clarity, Lyra focused her will, channeling her psychic energy into the shard. The crystal began to glow brighter, its energy resonating with her own. Celis, recovered from his fight with Dax, watched in horror as Lyra connected with the shard. "No. What are you doing?" "I'm setting it free," Lyra replied, her voice filled with determination. "This power belongs to the galaxy, not to any one person or faction." A surge of energy erupted from the shard, engulfing the temple in a blinding light. The militia soldiers cried out in pain as their weapons and armor disintegrated. Celis screamed as his body began to dissolve, his ambition and lust for power consuming him. When the light faded, the temple was gone, replaced by a field of swirling energy. Lyra stood at its center, her eyes glowing with the light of the shard. "It's done," she said, turning to Dax and Rin. "The shard is no longer a threat." General Voss, miraculously still alive, stumbled to his feet, his face a mask of defeat. "It's not over," he rasped. "The militia will return." "Maybe," Dax said, his hand resting on his blaster. "But we'll be ready for you." As they left Ethel aboard the Iron Wraith, Dax looked at Lyra, who was staring out at the stars. "What happens now?" he asked. "I don't know," she replied. "But I know that we'll face it together." Dax smiled, taking her hand in his. He had started this job for the credits, but he was staying for something more. He was staying for Lyra, the Andrelian diplomat who had shown him that even in the darkest corners of the galaxy, there was still hope. Rin chuckled from the pilot's seat. "Well, this has been fun, but I think I need a vacation after this one." As they jumped into hyperspace, leaving the desolate planet behind, Dax knew that their journey was far from over. But with Lyra by his side and Rin watching their backs, he was ready for whatever the galaxy threw their way. The ecliptic shard was gone, but its legacy would live on, a testament to the power of hope, courage, and love in a galaxy filled with darkness.